Right, today we're going to answer the simple question that we asked last video, how to maximize muscle protein synthesis. Before we can answer how to maximize it, let's first ask the question that would come before that. What even is muscle protein synthesis? So muscle protein synthesis is stimulated by mechanical tension in our training, and it is fed by the proteins that we eat that get broken down into amino acids. But then, we talk about how it's stimulated, how it's made, what actually is muscle protein synthesis. So when we have adequate dietary protein and mechanical tension, that breakdown allows us to build new muscle strands, convert that dietary protein into those muscles. That's basically the long and short, simple form of it. So if we want to spike muscle protein synthesis and get that party started, training hard, a hard training session will spike muscle protein synthesis, and eating protein, especially big portions of protein with above this 3 gram of leucine, which is one of the amino acids that's very important for muscle protein synthesis. It's almost one of those things we see, a common trend when we have greater levels of leucine, the muscle protein synthesis and the benefits we get are also greater. So when we look at the protein sources we get, if we're eating 40 grams of protein in a meal, we do want at least 3 or so grams of that to come from leucine. A bit nerdy, but some proteins aren't as complete as others. So, things like vegetables that don't have that full amino acid profile, we want to make sure that we get that 3 grams of leucine in that meal, and then, 40 grams onwards of proteins in that meal to cause that spike in muscle protein synthesis. So those are the important things. Training hard will spike muscle protein synthesis, and eating protein in an adequate amount with an adequate amount of leucine will also spike muscle protein synthesis. And when we say spike, this elevation and this building only lasts for a few hours, about 3 hours from each meal. So if you space your meals apart too far, you'll be leaving opportunities for that muscle protein synthesis on the table. So if you have your meals every 2 hours, every 3 hours, you'll have more opportunities, more windows throughout the day for growth, because you'll be triggering this more often. Also, another important part, we've got our training, we've got our eating, we also need our sleeping. When we're asleep, this is when our body will produce the most amount of growth hormone. This is also when our body can get into a state for repair and recovery to get those muscles growing. For muscle protein synthesis, getting a good night's sleep, 7 or more hours is perfect. If you can't get 7 hours, you need to start working on your sleep hygiene. The way you approach the rest of your day needs to sort of come to have caffeine pulled away from bedtime, blue lights and phones put away an hour before bedtime, the last meal of the day, maybe 2 hours before you're supposed to be snoring, and these sort of things to make sure that you can get to sleep before you look at taking supplements to help with your sleep. But sleep is a crucial part of the equation. It's just as important as eating and training. If you eat really well and you train really well, but you only get 3 hours of sleep a night, you're not going to have all of the pieces of the puzzle, and it's not going to work together very well at all. So if we put that in some sort of rules we can apply to help maximize that muscle protein synthesis, we're going to be wanting to train hard 3 to 5 times per week. Ideally, we want 2 sessions on each body part, no matter how our split comes. Twice on each muscle each week is the most optimal, most beneficial. We're going to want to eat a high protein meal every 2 to 3 hours with at least 3 grams of leucine or more. We're going to want to sleep for 7 or more hours every night, and we're going to want to avoid constant fatigue. Other things we can look at avoiding that blunt muscle protein synthesis and almost work against us is drinking alcohol, smoking, NSAIDs, so non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs like ibuprofen and those sorts of things. They can blunt our response to training, and therefore they can blunt muscle protein synthesis. There's plenty of medicines and drugs. I'm not a doctor. I'm not telling you what you should or shouldn't take, but there is plenty of things. If you get the packet and you read them and you do a little quick Google, does X, Y, or Z lower inflammation or lower muscle protein synthesis? If the answer is yes, it might be something you need to avoid, especially if it's part of your daily ritual. I know high levels of caffeine. I know everyone loves caffeine in their energy drinks, but they can certainly have this anabolic effect and put us more in that catabolic AMPK state as opposed to this anabolic mTOR state that we want. So that's another thing to bear in mind with the sort of supplement regimes we have. If we're getting in those high enough grammage of leucine in those high protein meals, we shouldn't need to play around with BCAAs or EAAs or any kind of amino acid supplement. But then in terms of things like protein powder, like whey proteins, like hydroisolate, isolate, concentrate, all of those things, those are usually good for the amino acid profile. They're usually high in leucine, intentionally made that way to be optimal for this muscle growth. And because they're very fast digesting, these protein powders, that spike does come on a lot quicker. And then in the literature, it's sort of the size of the spike and how quick it comes up and how quick it goes down is quite important to whether it's good or not. It seems like slower spiking proteins might not have the same effect on growth as faster ones more frequently. So as in like 3 feedings of a slow protein versus like 5 feedings of a fast. If you were to have the same total protein, the more frequent, faster spikes would be more beneficial than the fewer, slower spikes, which is interesting to look at. So when I say eat every 2 to 3 hours, if I say this video is all about maximizing, if you really were to want to be maximizing, you'd probably want to be every 2 hours with something quick to digest that's light on the stomach, as opposed to if you were eating every 3 hours, you could get away with something slower to digest. So sort of those things like red meats and those fatty cuts of meat that are a bit slower to digest, like beef, thighs, porks, lambs. If you're that kind of guy and you like those kind of things, those will be a bit slower than like your chickens, your white fish, your white meat, your whey proteins. And then yogurts as well are quite slow. You know, you got Greek yogurts, cottage cheese, skyr, whatever you want, those dairy products, they're quite slow on the stomach as well. So if you're looking at putting those slower on the stomach meals at the end of the day before bed, that's a pretty good idea, because then you'll be digesting that all through while you sleep. But then your quicker protein, quicker to digest ones, you want that spike pre and post training, because that's when you'll get the most benefit from it. It seems like we get an extra synergistic effect from that post training window protein. I know the anabolic window, everyone always clowns on it and says, but it seems like the extra muscle protein synthesis we get from training and then the extra nutrient uptake we get post workout does put us in a good situation to have some fast uptaking proteins right after we train. So clearly a big part of it's training, a big part of it's eating, a big part of it's sleeping. And if we're going to want to hone in and maximize that eating, we are going to need to look at maximizing our digestion. You know, not all foods are created equal, not all proteins are created equal. And if we're eating foods that our bodies aren't best friends with, you know, we're feeling bloating, we've got problems with our stool, you know, we've got diarrhea, we've got very hard bowels. We need to look at what we're eating, how it's working. If we're gassy all the time, it's not just like I'm a bodybuilder, of course I'm going to have protein farts. That might be the protein sources you're eating aren't agreeing with you. They're not being broken down in your stomach. They're going through to your intestines. They're causing all this smell. They're causing all this gas. They're causing all this bloating. You might need to look at changing those sources, because there's no point having a suboptimal for you protein source, especially if you're something like lactose intolerant. Maybe getting all your protein from whey and dairy is just shooting yourself in the foot. If you're not a big fan of the way your body handles red meat, for example, if that leaves you bloated and winded, then switch to white meat, vice versa. If you get away really well with eggs and you love eating eggs, go for it. If eggs for you, it feels like every time you eat eggs, wind, problems, you need to look at your digestion and whether those foods are right for you and whether the quantity of those foods is too high in some meals or too low in others. So if you're having like a whole rotisserie chicken first thing in the morning and then only having small sparing protein meals throughout the rest of the day, you might look at saying, right, this is probably a bit too front loading on the protein. That meal is really filling us up and it's just not going through me properly. I'd probably rather cut that into the rest of the meals and have them all be a similar size and then just have a slightly larger one after I train. Those sorts of things. In terms of taking supplements for digestion and eating things for digestion, it needs to be a case where we actually address the cause, not the symptom. So we need to find out what we're eating or what we're doing is causing us to have digestive issues, as opposed to just taking a pill and hoping that fixes it, because we'll still, at the end of the day, be eating something that is causing a problem, and then we'll just be curing a symptom as opposed to removing a cause. So lots of the times, simplifying your diet, stripping things back until you feel A-okay and good, and you know you can digest what you're eating, and then adding things in, and then knowing if those changes are negative or positive. So things like white rice, white meat, white fish, you know, those are all pretty easy on anyone's stomach. Rice for some people, I know I've just said it's easy on some people can't get along with rice either. So potatoes, pastas, those sorts of things. and then go from there, work on adding things, seeing if things go right or wrong, because clearly eating protein is an important part of it, but then eating protein that we actually want our bodies to break down and absorb fully, the absorption rate of that protein is also very important. The amount we can uptake and the speed and the rate at which we uptake that as well. So some slower digesting proteins might not be optimal post-workout. Some fast ones might not be optimal right before we go to bed. Just things to take into account. But then there's also the amino acid profiles of some of these proteins, especially ones that don't come from meat, things like oats and veggies and vegan alternatives. They might not have that complete amino acid profile. They might also be quite high in fiber, so they might be slowing that digestion down an extra layer. So we need to look at those meals. If we are having those higher fiber protein sources that don't come from animals, maybe incorporating some supplementation with that leucine to help that muscle protein synthesis get started. So just a quick rule on the sort of digestive speeds we're looking for the protein sources. We're going to want those fast digesting pre and post workout. We're going to want those slow digesting pre-bed, and we're going to want those mid for all of the rest of our meals. So if we're eating 5 meals, 2 of those are going to be from fast sources, pre and post. That last meal of the day is going to be a slow one, and then the other 2 are going to be that mid digesting. So we could be looking at have something like whey before we train, whitefish after we train. We could be looking at having chicken for the other meals, and then red meat or yogurt before we go to bed. Something quite simple, something quite light, something easy like that our stomach gets along with. So thank you guys for watching. I'll put the question to you. Is there anything else that you can think of that would help maximize or increase the amount of muscle protein that we can synthesize in a day? Anything I've missed off? Any supplements, any sort of things like that, regimes, things that you've heard about, read about that I've not mentioned? Drop them down in the comments and let me know. I'd always be interested in having a look, having a read, seeing you guys' opinions. But yeah, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and thank you all so much for watching. So I'll see you guys.